The huge clock in the bell tower of Town Hall in the center of Hallow Grove had just struck 1 p.m. And behind a barricaded door and shuttered windows inside the sheriff's office a couple of blocks away, the sheriff, 2 of his deputies and 2 office staff were hiding behind a large overturned desk in the main office, trying not to make any noise. One of the deputies, a tough, old-school man in his late 50s, wiped the sweat from his brow. "Mike, you all right?" Sheriff Jim Sutter asked, not liking what he was seeing. His friend's face was pale and his breathing was raspy and labored. It was possible he was having a heart attack or was about to, which was very bad. "Yeah," he rasped through the grimace. "Just the old ticker racing and tweaking a bit, but I'm good otherwise." Jim nodded and reloaded his shotgun with shells. "Well, you stay still and Ben and I will take care of this, whatever the hell this is." They'd been stuck in the office for nearly 3 hours now, and it was hot and stuffy, and they were all hungry and thirsty, which didn't help Mike one bit. He had to find a way to get him to the clinic 4 blocks away, but it didn't look like it was gonna be anytime soon. The day had started pretty much like it did every day, with roll call at 6 a.m. in the yard out back, followed by a debriefing of the night deputy duties in the conference room. Nothing much had happened during the night, he was told by Charlie and Evan, who were on night duty for the next few nights. And Jim sent them home before meeting with his 6 day deputies and 2 staff members to go over the day's duties and patrol routes. The meetings usually didn't last long because Hallow Grove was a town that rarely had any criminal activity. The I-87 ran through the town and then disappeared back into a dense ancient forest that had been there before the town and would be there long after. Jim had come to Hallow Grove 8 years ago with his family, seeking the tranquility and safety of country living after leaving the big city soon after he'd been shot during a manhunt for a murder suspect. His wife Marie had begged him to leave the force, but being the man he was, he didn't want to give up the badge and so began looking for an alternative. Going online, he searched for law enforcement jobs in small towns and soon found a posting for a sheriff in Hallow Grove. He found it odd that the departments in the town of 5,000 residents hadn't elected a new sheriff in-house, but on a whim he decided to apply. When the call came that his application was successful, he drove the 300 miles alone for the interview in the isolated town that sat in a hidden valley surrounded by miles of forest in every direction. The drive through the forest was interesting, to say the least, and he marveled at how the trees grew over the road to join their branches together and create a natural tunnel. He had to put on his headlights at one point when it became too dark to see clearly, and it had a menacing feel about it, which he put down to an overactive imagination. His arrival in Hallow Grove was sudden and bright as he turned a corner, and he was amazed by the contrast. It was a pretty and beautifully maintained town with old brick buildings and attractive architecture dating back well over a century. The sheriff at the time was in his 60s and wanted to retire, and the next man in line for the job, Mike Holston, had a bad heart and so had chosen not to take it, partly at the insistence of his wife and children. Sheriff Gaines was very impressed with Jim's career of 15 years as a city detective and told him that if it was up to him, he could have the job right away. There was just one thing. Both he and his wife had to meet the townsfolk and mayor first, and only if they approved could he start. Jim agreed to meet with them, understanding that he had to do things their way. then called his wife to tell her the tentative good news. She told him that she would catch a bus to Hallow Grove after dropping off Jamie and Nicholas, 2 and 4 respectively, at her mother's place. The sheriff, in the meantime, organized a town meeting in the town hall while they waited for Marie to arrive. While he waited for Marie, he explored the attractive town with Gaines and was introduced to the big players. In other words, the people he needed to win over the most. But Jim was already well aware of the kind of people living in isolated towns because he'd grown up in one as a kid before his mom had divorced his dad and they'd moved with his sister to the city. The people were friendly, with the usual suspicion and occasional veiled hostility thrown in. However, Jim wasn't fazed by this. He was a stranger and had to earn their respect and acceptance before they opened up to him. During their walk about town, Jim saw that Gaines was well loved and respected, which wasn't surprising after 30 years of dedicated service. There were many things that needed tightening up in the department, and a few boundaries between the residents and the sheriff and deputies that had slipped or crumbled altogether. But Jim kept this to himself, and over the years that followed, slowly made the needed changes he wanted to make so that the town's older folk wouldn't resist too much. The meeting turned out better than anticipated, and with Marie by his side, he presented himself confidently and shared his vision for the town and its safety. He was told by the sheriff before the meeting that there were families living in Hallow Grove whose ancestors dated back hundreds of years. So Jim focused on them during his speech and assured them that he wasn't there to change the way things had always been done, and that he would carry on the excellent work Sheriff Gaines and his deputies were already doing. A vote was taken that very night and Jim was unofficially elected the new sheriff, until the paperwork was taken care of and the mayor signed off on it. Marie was over the moon. After saying their farewells to Sheriff Gaines and his wife, who had hosted them during their visit, and asking the only real estate business in town to find them a suitable home close to the center of town, Jim and Marie returned to the city to resign from their jobs and begin the arduous process of packing up their lives and moving to their new home with their 2 young children. Their new house was waiting for them when they arrived in Hallow Grove with their possessions, and they were welcomed warmly by their neighbors, although a few still chose to keep their distance initially. Another loud bang sounded near the barricaded front door, and they all jumped. Sylvia's eyes were big and round, and she had her hand over her mouth to stop from screaming, and Jim gave her shoulder a squeeze. He didn't show it, but he was just as afraid as his young assistant. Ben, a young deputy at 25, and Sally, a no-nonsense, super confident widow in her late 50s, and their experienced dispatcher, were trying to be brave. And Jim drew in a deep breath to calm his racing heart and come up with the solution. But how was he going to do that when he still didn't know what the hell was happening outside? The weird mist had rolled in around 7, and Jim had gone out to help his deputies patrol and warn people to drive slowly if they needed to get anywhere. Otherwise, they were to stay indoors until the mist lifted. But by 8, it hadn't, which was strange because the weather service had declared clear skies and a warm temp of at least 82 in their area for the day. After checking on 2 bumper bashings, one on the main street and one in a suburb on the edge of town, Jim returned to the office to deal with the paperwork he knew was already piling on his desk. Sally handed him a large mug of coffee as he arrived, as was their daily routine, and he spent the next hour and a half working with one ear on his deputies calling in and informing Sally about everything they were dealing with. There were the occasional collisions and a few cows that had escaped their fields, no doubt confused by the odd mist. But otherwise, the day continued like every other. Jim finished his third cup of coffee, and the end of his paperwork was in sight when a booming, hollow horn sounded. Scaring the bejesus out of him and the ladies, he looked up at the office clock and saw that it was 10 a.m. and he went to the intake room to look outside the big window facing the main street. They hadn't had any visitors in the office yet, which wasn't that uncommon, and he stepped outside in case the horn sounded so he could hear the direction it was coming from. He grabbed his chest and cursed as he swiveled to face east. Goosebumps covered him head to toe, and something deep inside him told him that the sound wasn't made by any instrument he was familiar with. If he could compare it, the closest thing was those great horns on the massive cargo ships on the high seas, but this had a haunting echo that seemed to touch his very soul and send terror rippling through him, and he couldn't understand why. After the second horn, Sally came running outside to tell him that the radio was going crazy. When he stepped inside, all the phones were ringing, and he followed Sally to the dispatch corner while Ben, Mike, and Sylvia dealt with the phone calls. His deputies were talking over each other, saying crazy things about people acting weird and something happening to them. But one of the calls freaked Jim out completely. Deputy Stephen McCoy was speaking to him about 2 vehicle collisions on the main street opposite Town Hall when he began making the creepiest sounds. When Jim asked him if he was okay, Steve started grunting, and then the grunts turned into growls and heavy breathing. All the hairs on Jim's body had stood on end when he looked at Sally. She had her hand over her mouth and her eyes were stretched wide. She looked as confused as he felt, and he asked Steve if he was all right. But his radio suddenly cut out, and so did all the other calls from his deputies and the phones at exactly the same time, leaving the room in deathly silence. When he turned around, he saw Mike and Ben consoling a weeping Sylvia. And Mike explained that she'd been on the phone with her husband when he suddenly screamed loud enough for Mike to hear. And she dropped the phone in shock. When Mike had picked up to ask if he was all right, he had heard the creepiest growling noise before the line went dead. Jim didn't know what to make of it, and by the looks on everyone's faces, neither did they. And he took a moment to think and tried not to panic. They'd lost contact with all of their deputies, and when Sally checked the landlines and radio again, she confirmed that the lines were dead. He asked everyone to check their mobile phones, and they confirmed that there was no signal. Is this an invasion of some sort? Jim wondered. So to be prepared, he ordered Ben and Mike to arm themselves and then lock up the office until he could figure out what was going on. His duty was to protect those he was with for now. The doors had just been locked when a large rock was thrown through the front window from out of the mist, and Jim immediately ordered everyone to hunker down in the main office while he closed and activated the lock of the thick glass door that separated the intake room from the main area. The security door had always been part of the office, but had never been used. Mike had told him that when he first started as sheriff, because in a safe town like Hallow Grove, it wasn't needed. It was going to take more than a rock to break through the reinforced glass, and Jim was relieved to have the additional security. He also tipped over the biggest desk they had, with Ben's help, behind which they had decent cover in case anyone tried to break in. Until they had a better plan and figured out what was going on, staying in the office with all the ammo was the best course of action. And while he prayed that Marie and the children were safe at work and in school, he tried not to give in to his overwhelming fear and confusion. Whatever was happening was highly unusual, and he couldn't help but wonder if the weird mist had something to do with it.